Good morning and happy Friday to everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of Stellarvision. I'm Brandon Hegel, the Chief Digital Officer here at Stellar Rising, and I'm particularly excited to present today's episode, mainly because it's integral to a lot of the work I do here at Stellar Rising and certainly is impactful to the business performance of many of our clients. Today, we're going to be discussing measurement in today's ever-changing landscape and how some marketing questions our analytics team typically helps answer for a number of our clients are going to be helpful looking today, in the future, and certainly coming through the holiday period that's staring us right down the barrel. Joining me today is our VP of Analytics, Zafreen Zarilli. Zafreen has nearly 15 years of analytics experience. She has a background in financial risk management and advanced analytics and media measurement, where she's spent the bulk of her career. She also brings along an MBA from Yale, where she's done significant amount of work and certainly understanding the business impacts of and applications of analytics on businesses. So needless to say, she's a very smart cookie, and we're thrilled to have her today to be able to talk us through some of the measurement applications for our business. So welcome, Zafreen.
Thank you, Brandon. I'm really excited to host today's session, episode 18, Measure Better and Perform Better. So we could dive right in. Great. So I want to just set the landscape for everyone around common measurement challenges. We have many tools in place that can help us understand the incrementality of media, but the truth is most of these tools are inaccurate or really just very different from one another. So it's very challenging to find a single source of truth. So just to quickly discuss what I mean about these inaccuracies is, let's look at site analytics platforms, for example, such as Google Analytics or an Adobe product. We find that this platform, although we can see many channels at once, we have issues when it comes to last touch click credit. And what that essentially means is that the platform is giving credit to a conversion based on a last touch only. So for example, if I saw a video on YouTube and it sparked some interest in your brand, and then I moved on to clicking on a social banner, but then ultimately converted on organic search would get 100% credit for that conversion, even though that seems a bit arbitrary when we know organic search and direct are typical in terms of user behavior online. We know that people use that as a way to convert at the end, but it's not necessarily what made you convert in the end. So oftentimes in site analytics tools, awareness or acquisition strategies are often underplayed, where conversion driving strategies or just touch points that are typical in user behavior prior to a conversion are overinflated, such as search and direct. So we have issues in terms of that in our site analytics tools. And again, we're in the world of click only. So we know people don't typically click on video ads. That's just not what people do. We watch a video and then we move on to the next step, or we go to the site by typing it into our browser. So on a click only way of looking at credit, we're at a huge disadvantage because video and tactics that are typically not clickable are not getting any credit for a conversion, which essentially means that your organic and your search and some of those lower funnel tactics will be overinflated in what really resulted in incremental revenue or a KPI that you might be measuring. Now we can go to media platforms such as the Facebooks and the Pinterest and the AdWords of the world. Great, we now can account for view-through credit, but now we're in an issue of duplication. And what that means is that as a customer, I might have clicked on a Facebook ad and watched a YouTube video and converted, and each platform will say, oh, I drove that conversion. So if I add them together, you get 3 conversions when it only resulted in 1. And that happens because of the silo view. AdWords and Facebook aren't talking to each other. AdWords sees that I clicked on a search ad, and therefore that search ad drove the conversion. They have no insight in what I did outside of that journey, so outside of that particular platform. And then there's within tool attribution solutions. So this seems like great, maybe this can help me too, but they have issues as well, unfortunately, because many of them don't account for view through credit. So a more sophisticated attribution model that you might get from a GA360 is still only click based. And also many times attribution solutions are rules based. And what does that mean? That means I am giving credit arbitrarily based on a rule. So I'm going to give 100% credit to last touch, or I'll give 100% credit to first touch, or I'll just make it even. Everybody gets 25%. But it's arbitrary. It's not actually driven by data. It's not a data-informed insight. So it doesn't tell me, would I have converted with or without that touch point? Really, what's the incrementality of media versus maybe baseline revenue, what you would have gotten regardless of media due to seasonality or other components. And then we have the issues that are facing us today around changing environments. So privacy regulations that are being enforced right now, and the loss of cookies and identifying markers. So this just makes the world even more complicated in trying to get the truth in what my return is for my investment.
So, Zafreen, do you think it's fair to say that there was kind of a reliance on using platforms for measurement and using last click as kind of default for many marketers because it was easy and it was tangible? But now with a lot of the changes that are happening in terms of privacy and identity, that it's forcing people to kind of rethink measurement as kind of the ability to kind of do attribution or fractional crediting, right, of media touch points, as that consumer journey has become so fragmented and harder to track on an individual basis that maybe it's time to take a step back to some more traditional approaches in terms of how we measure, looking at, kind of the 30,000-foot view in terms of your media impacts.
Oh, absolutely. Like, I completely agree that a lot of reliance on these platforms were due to the ease and of data availability, and that just makes life easier. But if it's giving you wrong information at the end of the day and you're optimizing all that information, it's just discrediting the potential that media can drive your overall business. And so using different modeling techniques, and actually that's a great segue, Brandon, to what I want to talk about, which is Spark. And Spark is a Stellar Rising proprietary solution on how to accurately measure the incrementality of your marketing efforts, and taking that a step further and plan and optimize accordingly. So we don't just stop and say, hey, we applied these advanced analytics techniques such as multi-touch attribution, market mix modeling, brand health tracking, or control versus exposed testing. We use a variety of those techniques and a combination of those techniques to give you that true return on ad spend, but we don't stop there. Within the Spark solution, we provide you that answer. So in reality, Facebook told you it drove a $3 ROAS, and GA told you it drove a 25 cents ROAS, but the truth is it actually drove a $2 ROAS. Okay, great, Zafreen, now what, right? So we don't stop there. With Spark, we make sure that we take that insight and we plan against it using response curves. So what is a response curve really? So a response curve is really the looking at media response based on changing levels of spend. So that $2 ROAS that I told you was the correct ROAS for Facebook because we applied multiple advanced analytics techniques to determine so. Maybe that's already at a point of saturation. Maybe you've already maxed out that platform in terms of incremental revenue to be driven, because ROAS is not flat, it is dynamic. If you flood the market with media, the incrementality will diminish. And you at one point, you are going to experience diminishing returns versus earlier spend levels where maybe you drove a $2 ROAS for Facebook with $200,000 of spend. If I quadruple that spend, you're not going to necessarily still drive a $2 ROAS. You are at a different point in your response function. Versus if I cut the spend by half, maybe that ROAS is actually even higher because I'm in a more optimal state within my curve. So when you're at the steepest portion of your curve, so the x-axis being incremental dollars spent, and the y-axis being changes in your KPI, your dollar will just move so much further for you. Versus if you're at the already flatter portion of your curve where you're experiencing diminishing returns. And by looking at this at a channel or tactic level, the curves are not the same by channel. Typically, we see that TV has more potential to drive reach and therefore maintain a level before experiencing diminishing returns, but it might not have the initial steepness of something like social. So in order to make those insights that we're getting from advanced analytics and getting you those true ROASs actually to be impactful, we need to know how to plan against it. And Spark is a comprehensive solution to do just that.
So Zafreen, to say that kind of in summary, effectively, it's allowing you to model out curves that are going to help you determine some sort of outcome, right? So it might be your right spend level by channel, it might be your media mix allocation, it might be, what the right scalability is for channel. So it's going to help answer a number of different marketing, budgeting, and allocation questions.
Exactly. That is exactly right.
And one other question for you there. So what
Sure.
sort of, before moving on to the use cases, what sort of requirements are there for developing Spark curves? Is that something that would be applicable if it's just a single channel? Are there certain investment levels? Talk to us about what's required to be able to leverage the Spark platform and tool.
Sure. So it's actually not, you don't have to have that much, which is what makes the tool so incredibly flexible and useful for our clients. In the days where you had to only build a market mix model and have 6 months to a year's worth of data and you needed to have across multiple channels, that's not really the issue anymore in this case, because what we do is we can look at your using multiple advanced analytics techniques and not just rely on a single one. We can understand how media's performed for you for at least, I would say you would need at least a month's worth of data that media is present for, and to understand the incrementality of it. In addition to that, it's helpful to have multiple strategies that you want to test. So to really make it very useful in terms of if I want to move out of this type of strategy and test a new one, there are great use cases if you have things like that in mind. But in terms of an initial data set, not a lot is required because we could do different advanced analytics techniques to measure. If it's not one, it can be the other. That doesn't maybe potentially require so much data. But also, we can use Spark as a benchmarking tool. So oftentimes we have clients who maybe never launched media before. They come to us and they're like, listen, I don't really know what to expect. I've never done this before and I have no historical data to share with you. So the benefit there is we as an agency created our own internal data stack so that we have across beauty, many clients that are fueling information, across retail, across many verticals. And the great part of that is you could still use Spark as an understanding for expectations if you don't have your own data through benchmarking. So it's incredibly flexible in terms of use cases.
Excellent. Thank you.
You're welcome. So Brandon, you alluded to this, which is great. There's some key questions that Spark can help us answer. And these are the questions that marketers come to us all the time and have. I'm going to read these questions out loud, and the subsequent slides in the deck is actually going to give you some real client examples on how we answer these questions to make this not so esoteric, because I know that's often an issue with analytics. So question 1, what is my optimized budget allocation across tactic, and what yields can I expect? Often a question that clients come to us with. How much should I spend to meet a certain revenue goal? Q4 is coming up. It's holiday time. We have certain revenue expectations, and we want to make sure that we're well positioned with our media allocation and spend to meet those expectations. Am I at a point of saturation within a marketing channel? At what spend level does it make to introduce a new channel if I'm already at a point of saturation with an existing one, for example? And then what is my return on ad spend or an awareness lift that I can expect with my budget? So this is an example with the awareness lift one of how we can use other clients' data and that data stack view to help establish benchmarks ahead of time so that you can really measure yourself whether you were successful or not. So we'll dive into the first one. What is my optimized budget allocation across tactic and what yields can I expect? So within the comprehensive Spark solution, this client was across multiple channels, TV, programmatic, social, and online video. And we ran a market mix model for them within Spark and developed these curves. And this particular client had their budget, over 80% of their budget was sitting on television. And that 80% of budget was already at a flatter portion of the TV curve, which means that it only makes sense to curb that spend back into other channels that might be spending much less and therefore at a steeper portion of their curve, which means the marginal ROI is better. So instead of adding, let's say, an additional $5,000 in TV, its incremental ROI for that additional $5,000 has plummeted. So it only makes sense to put it into another channel. This optimization exercise is a pure mathematical exercise. We are looking at the curves and the marginal ROIs to be at a state where you would not make any more money than if I allocated any differently. We are in a pure optimized state given, let's say, a budget requirement. So a budget requirement is like we have, let's say, $10 million to spend. How should I allocate that to optimize my revenue? And on the right-hand side was the optimized allocation. So they're over 80% in TV spend fell to closer to 70%. And we determined that if the allocation is done in this manner, we expect a 6% jump in overall revenue. So to move on to the next example, how much should I spend to meet a revenue goal? So in this example, and this is definitely heavily applicable for holiday period time and Q4, is the client was spending about, now we're looking at all of media in aggregate, and the client was spending about $3 million in revenue. So the first example, the advanced analytics part of Spark was an MMM. And believe it, and we do combinations too, because sometimes it's necessary to do combinations. But here we were looking specifically at a match market test and looking at total media and what it drove in terms of incremental revenue. And we saw that total media of a $3 million spend was driving close to a $2 ROAS or $6 million in revenue. And the client needed to and wanted to hit $8 million in revenue. They had a goal and they wanted to come back to us and understand how much they needed to spend overall. And that answer was about $5.25 million. Now, you can't just assume that $2 ROAS is still $2 if I double my investment, as I mentioned before. We have to look at the marginal ROI at every additional point of investment level to determine what your total investment is needed to drive a certain goal.
Hey, Safreen, so you touched on holiday there. I'd imagine, with 2020 being the year that it is, with such an uptick in terms of e-commerce activity, given so many people are not going, to brick and mortar retail, and certainly as holiday approaches and season coincides with that we're going to see, a historical record year most likely for e-commerce activity. So I would imagine that leveraging this tool would be helpful for understanding, especially this year, the importance of what could be spent and what could be expected from return for 2020. And also, how do you factor in when you have kind of outlier events like an uptick in e-commerce activity, COVID? Is that something that's factored into the curves?
Oh, absolutely. We want to make sure these curves are really taking recency into account. So we would definitely incorporate variables such as lifts that we expect above baseline revenue due to the current environment. So because what fuels Spark, the data that fuels Spark is incredibly flexible, right? It can involve an attribution and a market mix modeling exercise and match market test. It can also look at the expectations in terms of baseline revenue, so we can understand from a client's own history what they typically expect during holiday time. And given the fact that we've invested in ourselves in terms of an internal data stack, and see what the lifts have been, and we have been doing this actually, Brandon, you know, in our newsletters, is to understand what kind of additional impact have we been tracking that COVID is really incurring on. So we would include that type of information in this type of analysis. Yes.
Great.
Okay. So next question. Am I at a point of saturation with a certain marketing channel? This is a great question, and it happens very often. This particular client, I believe, was a beauty client, and they were driving pretty much all of their spend was in social conversion tactics. And they felt justified in that allocation because GA told them that the ROAS was really strong, and the Facebook platform also told them that it was strong. But the truth, of course, is not reliable using those platforms due to all the things I told you earlier. So for them, we actually did a combination. So Spark again. So we did Spark and looked at attribution modeling in addition to market mix modeling to get really a true understanding of what their social conversion tactics were driving in terms of incrementality. And if you look at the diagram on the right, the dot is where they were currently spending on the x-axis and the revenue they were achieving for that spend. But you could just see visually that they were already flatlining. And it made perfect sense because they knew their customer growth was not as strong as they wanted it to be. So, but now it's like, okay, but what do I do with this information? We recommend that they pull spend back to a more optimal level prior to experiencing diminishing returns, and see if it's more fruitful to invest in other channels so you get the overall biggest bang for your buck, so to speak. Which actually brings us to the next question for the same client they had, is at what spend level should it make sense to introduce a new channel, and what can it help garner in terms of revenue? So for this particular client, we saw that, so this graph looks a little different from the preceding graphs, and that's because this is not simply spend against revenue, but this is spend against incremental ROAS. So the way you would interpret this chart is if we look at the pink social conversion line, we saw that additional spend, so additional $5,000 levels of spend, that additional $5,000 was generating a lower and lower ROAS, to a point where it actually made sense where these two curves cross to put an additional $5,000 instead of going from $50,000 to $55,000 for social conversion. It made sense to put that $5,000 into another tactic, which ROAS was now at this point stronger than the $5,000 added to an existing $50,000 budget for social conversion. And you could see this immediately just on the left-hand side. If they spent around $100,000 in social, they would be generating a 70 cents ROAS, which you could actually see in this preceding graph right here. $100,000 in spend driving about $70,000 in revenue, which means that's what they get. But if instead, because they were already saturated in social conversion, given their existing awareness level. So here's the thing, right? This client was investing a ton of money on conversion, and not growing their awareness, which means the cookie pool that you remarket to is not growing. And it was basically flatlining them. They've already hit a diminishing point of returns. But it doesn't sound like a lot of money to hit a diminishing point of returns when the, P&Gs of the world are spending a lot more. So why am I hitting diminishing point of returns? Because your awareness level doesn't exist. These two go hand in hand. Your curves will change in shape given your reach and awareness levels in market. Okay, so if you start investing in video strategy, we expect that your conversion tactics will actually have additional upside because you can convert now on a more well-aware, an audience that's more well aware of your brand. So just in case that was the question. So if I actually curb spend back to $45,000, and again, this is based on their own data, the ROAS for that amount would be about $1.28, generating $58,000. And it makes more sense to put the remaining budget of $55,000 into a strategy that they were testing, video. Yes, it has a 60 cents ROAS for that additional 55,000. But if you look at an additional 55,000 for the social conversion spend, it's actually generating less than 60 cents ROAS, that incremental investment above $45,000, so that your total revenue is actually higher. So that's the problem sometimes when we look too much in silo and in channel and efficiency of one channel versus the other, is that at the end of the day, it doesn't matter as long as you're generating more revenue. So if we curb the spend back more for social and put it in video, we're actually driving 16% more revenue for the same flat budget. And that's because the incremental dollars that you were adding to social wasn't driving anything anymore. Great. So I'll move on to the next slide. Now, this is the one I wanted to spend a little time on, is because this is an opportunity when you might not have the data to use Spark as a way of benchmarking. So this particular client was doing a campaign where they wanted to drive awareness up, and they were going to spend $1 million on this campaign. And they wanted to know what they could potentially achieve in terms of an awareness lift with that $1 million. So here at Stellar Rising, we created our own proprietary internal data stack, which I mentioned before. We're very strict on data governance so that we can use this rich data and actually apply it and help our clients with benchmarking. And we looked at similar clients who also did brand health tracking studies to determine the curve we see right here. Now, what's interesting at this curve is how you would read it. We're looking at awareness level and the cost per additional awareness point on the left, on the y-axis. And what I wanted to note here is that we found that when a client already had a strong awareness level, it was incredibly expensive to move just one additional point. So what that means is for the Coca-Colas of the world who have like a 95% awareness, for them to move to 95 to 96 is going to cost a ton of money, exponentially more expensive than someone who has an existing awareness level of 15 or 20%. To move it one additional point is so much cheaper. So using this curve, we were able to understand the dynamic nature of a cost per awareness point to help the client ascertain what they could achieve with $1 million. Their initial existing awareness was around 40%, and you could see with the cost per additional awareness point that they could move maybe a maximum 2 points to with the $1 million that they have. So from moving it to 41 to 42 costs about $450,000, and moving it from 42 to 43 would cost another, let's say, $500,000. So they had expectations set so that they now have a way to measure success against this expectation. The particular client actually ended up with a 45% awareness, which is indexing at 105 against our benchmark, which is great because now the client knows that actually we did a really good job. We did more than what we expected to do. Maybe we could have been even better. But oftentimes clients can come back and they'd be like, oh, my awareness grew 10 points. Is that good? Is that bad? Should I have expected more? Should I have expected less? We can help set those expectations ahead of time so that you can show whether a campaign is successful or not at the end of the day. So I'm actually going to turn it over to Brandon for some closing remarks.
Yes, thanks, Safreen. That was wonderful and very helpful. I hope those in attendance, had their eyes open a little bit about ways that we can certainly think about measurement and forecasting and all the many use cases you walked through. So thank you very much. I think if there's any questions, we're a little over time. So please feel free to reach out to me or Zafreen directly with the information on the screen here. And of course, please tune in next week where we're going to have our partner Facebook join us to be presenting a special focus on the CPG category. As we know, social commerce is critical for brands seeking to drive revenue in 2020. So, Facebook always does a great job in partnership with our CPG team. And so you'll be coming away with a lot of fresh insights, best practices, certainly stronger ways to maximize, your business via social. So thank you for attending. We look forward to seeing you next week for our next session. And certainly, as we said, feel free to reach out with any questions. Thanks, Safreen. Thanks, everybody, and have a great weekend.
Thank you.